And there we go.
Well, it's very nice to be doing one of these, sitting down in a room rather than on a train or some other crazy situation. But for those of you who've not been following, this is the last week of my 6-week road trip. And I guess I will do the original, the typical introduction. And then once the event starts, I'll turn it over to Bob to do the interviewing, since I'm the subject this time.
11 hours.
What's 11 hours?
I don't know. I heard that too.
All right. Well, it's 11 o'clock here in Chicago, noon in the East Coast, 9 in Tucson. Welcome, everybody, and glad to have you here for yet another full moon. I'll run around the screen as I see it and let us know, first of all, what the weather's like, and secondly, where you were for the eclipse. So, Bob, where are you and where were you for the eclipse?
I'm in Clinton Township, Michigan, and I was at the National Museum of the United States Air Force near Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton. And my wife and I were there. There were 17,000 people through the door at the museum and 20,000 people outside. And my wife had a line that was 50 people long for 4 hours. So that was quite impressive.
And you told them all about the observatory, I hope.
Oh, yes, I did.
Excellent. I was in outside of Bloomington, Indiana, and actually ran into a friend of many of us here, Dina Weibel, who happened to be 10 minutes away. And it was thanks to her that we found a place with the internet that allowed us to do, Chris and I, to do the recording we did during the eclipse. Chris Olson, where were you?
I was set up at the Cincinnati Observatory, where I had a setup demonstrating Victorian era eclipse chasing, which was quite the fad. I used the replica Q photoheliograph to take some images of it. It was not at totality. We were at about 98%. But once again, more visitors took pictures of the eclipse than I did through that device, which I think makes it an unqualified success because it is being used to photograph the sun, even if it's just with cameras on selfie mode.
Fabulous. Can you hold up that the tintype that you showed us of the observatory?
This is one I did. I brought my camera as well.
Right. I've got a wonderful tintype he took of me that makes me look like I was working in the 19th century. So is that a tintype or daguerreotype? What's the difference?
Okay, a daguerreotype is an older process. It is done on a piece of fine silver or copper that has been silver plated. And you hold that over elemental iodine and then elemental bromine to give you a very thin, like couple molecule thick layer of a light sensitive layer. And then you process that over fuming mercury to develop it.
Oh, sounds great.
It is. It's great fun. A well-struck daguerreotype, of which I've done maybe 3 in my life. A well-struck daguerreotype to me is one of the prettiest images you can have. A collodion image is done on glass, or I use blackened aluminum for mine. You can make negatives or positives with this process, which is what made it a bigger commercial success, because you could then make paper prints, however many you want, from the negatives. I do tintypes because they're less fragile than glass. And it's a direct positive so that I can give them away right away without having to make a print. So you pour the collodion on, drain off the excess, put it into silver nitrate. The collodion has a bromine and iodine salt dissolved in it. So now you have silver nitrate, silver iodine, silver bromide, all in an emulsion layer instead of just a molecular, a chemical layer. You make the E exposure, and it's an ISO of about 1. Daguerreotype daguerreotype ISO is about 0.003. So it's a much faster process. You develop that just using iron sulfite and vinegar. So much friendlier. And then you fix the image. I use potassium cyanide, 1% solution of that. You can also use hypo, which is what modern photography still uses. The problem with that is you have to rinse it for tens of minutes. And if I'm out in the field, I don't have 100 gallons of water.
Right. Plus it
So,
makes your fingers stink, as I recall.
yes. Yeah, the kind of rotten egg smell.
Yep. Great. Well, thanks. That was
Thank you. Thank you.
And reminds me of my happy days in the darkroom many years ago. Chris Graney, where are you and where were you for the eclipse?
I was with you for the eclipse and west of Bloomington, and I am in Jeffersonville, Indiana, where I thought this would be a good place I could stand and do this because my neck and back are bothering me. And I thought I was in the wind lee of the building enough to block the wind, but apparently I'm not. And now you're getting to hear the Angelus from the local Catholic church that's going on. So, but it's a nice day, and hopefully I can mute out enough to keep the wind from being too obnoxious. I better quit now because the Angelus is getting really loud.
Sounds great. Joel Hopko, where were you for the eclipse?
I was right here in Green Valley. Thanks to Larry, loaned me some good quality glasses, and I was able to see approximately 80%, which was quite impressive. Of course, not like totality, but still worth the while and quite interesting. It's been very hot here now. We're starting to get into the 90s, so it's that time of year.
Okay. Dennis, where were you?
I'm in Denver today. I was in Marysville, Ohio, outside Marysville, Ohio, on a farm with 4 other people and more livestock than people.
Excellent. And you saw the eclipse. You actually were able to see it.
Yes, we were in totality. The skies were pretty clear, so it was very dramatic. We even could see with the naked eye one of the little shiny beads around 7 o'clock.
Oh, yeah. I've never seen a photograph that does justice to how brilliant that was to the naked eye.
Wally took some good pictures. I'll send you some.
Okay, great. Father Gregory.
I was in a parishioner's driveway here in Southington, Connecticut, looking at about a 93% partial eclipse through a filtered telescope and a welder's glass from a neighbor. And I watched on my cell phone some totality coverage with NASA television.
Okay. And Francis, where were you?
I had the joy and privilege of being with you all in Bloomington, Indiana. It was fantastic, and currently in Davenport, Iowa.
And
Fabulous.
in particular, for the eclipse, you were looking through my telescope some of the time.
We were. Thank you.
Indeed. Gary, where were you?
We were in Oswego. Well, I'm in Milwaukee here, but we traveled up to Oswego, upstate New York, where there was totality. Unfortunately, clouds moved in about 2 hours before, and as people were sort of giving up that they would see anything, then we saw the shadow of the moon come across the clouds till, of course, it was very dark, and then we head out to the northeast. So it was a different kind of experience, not seeing the sun itself, but seeing the shadow of the moon.
Fabulous. And Gary, the other Gary, Niziolik.
I was in Medfield, Wisconsin, and as luck would have it, it was cloudy. You couldn't even tell anything was going on. It was about 85% here on the eclipse. You couldn't tell the difference in the light at all.
That's too bad. Chris Kennedy, where were you?
I was in Buffalo, New York at Canisius College, the alma mater of Brendan Thompson, who I think a few of us here know. We had a table. I'll put a picture up, and the totality was very impressive. I'd never been in totality before, and even though it was kind of cloudy, it was very impressive.
Larry, where were you?
I was south on a large ranch south of Lampasas, Texas. Was there with, well, I was on the ranch. Associates of mine were at a campsite in downtown Lampasas. So between the two of us, we did 2 events with 4 telescopes, maybe 5 telescopes. Some just regular white filter and some H alpha telescopes. Very successful for both sites.
And you were able to see totality.
It cleared just a few minutes before. It was a little bit cloudy, but not enough to make a difference. We did see at least Venus and maybe Jupiter.
Okay. Did you see the prominence, the little red spot?
People were saying, "Oh, there's this thing coming off the bottom of it," and I'm going, "No, that's impossible." Bailey's beads are long gone, and then realized, no, it really is there. So it was sort of impressive.
Okay. Jim Wren, where were you?
Right here in Anthem, Arizona, just north of Phoenix. It was a beautiful day, about 70% coverage, and we're having good weather here in Phoenix. Thank you.
Fabulous. And oops, I was busy trying to catch up in the chat. I lost track of. Oh, yes, Tom. Tom, where were you?
I was where I am now in Langhorne, Pennsylvania, 93% totality, standing in front yard with a 600 millimeter telephoto lens and a solar filter, attracting neighbors who wanted to look through my scope, which was fun. And I got some pictures of the eclipse without clouds, and I got some neat pictures of eclipse with clouds. So it was a good day.
Excellent. Paul, where were you?
Well, we were here in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and only got brief glimpses in between quite a bit of clouds.
Okay. Jill, where were you?
I drove 3 hours to Ithaca, where my son and sister live, and then we drove another 3 hours to get into totality, and it was perfectly sunny until the moment of totality, and then the clouds came. But it was we got some really beautiful clouds, so pretty, very ominous feeling of looking out on we were high on a ridge, so we could kind of look out and had quite a view of the big shadow of the moon.
Fabulous. I was at an eclipse in '99 where it was clear until the eclipse started, and then it not only clouded up, it started raining hard where I was.
Well, I skipped the rain, luckily. Yeah.
Okay. Carmen, where of course you probably didn't see anything like the eclipse because I imagine you were in South America.
Is this a joke? I was and I am in South America. Thank you.
Indeed. Jeff, where were you?
I was on Long Island, New York, Manorville, and I had solar binoculars, so I went out in the backyard and sat down in a chair and waited for it to happen. So I got about 90% of it, but I could actually see it because of those solar binoculars, and it was pretty good. Pretty good. 90% wasn't 100%, but it was pretty good, reasonably good. So.
All right, Claude, where were you?
Hi. Well, I'm currently in Ottawa, but for the eclipse, we traveled to upstate New York to the Adirondack Sky Center and Observatory in Tupper Lake, where we reached totality.
And finally, William, where were you? William Gabriel. Okay, sometimes he has troubles connecting, I know. Okay, well, if you have anything, you can throw it into the chat. At this point, I'll turn it over to Paul Gabor. You can tell us first where you were for the eclipse and then what's happening right now at the VAT.
Well, we have connectivity issues right now.
Recording in progress.
So I have the impression that in fact I'm now connected twice. Sorry about that. That's weird.
And one of them is even turned off and you're still getting the echo.
Yeah.
Well, try turning that one off and turning the other one on.
Okay.
It seems a few people are coming and going and coming and going. It's tricky trying to keep track of who's where.
I can remove Paul's second thing here.
Okay, try that.
All right. So
all right, Paul, try talking now.
I've turned my cell phone off, so that
perfect. Okay, great. You're coming in loud and clear. Where were you, and what's happening at the telescope?
So I was originally supposed to go to Waco, but then the event organizers sent out an email about 6 months ago saying that the hotel changed the prices up to about $700 a night. So that meant that I had to go for a plan B. And the plan B was to go to a nice retreat house, which the society has just north of Dallas.
Society of Jesus, that is. Yes.
Right. So we had they were not very good at planning this because they didn't actually have anybody there for the eclipse. So that was nice. In fact, there was like 3 or 4 Jesuits, and that was it. And we had this lake for ourselves. So it was very pleasant, and we were lucky because in spite of the rather bleak weather forecast, we ended up having clear skies clear skies. The patch of the sky where the sun was clear during the totality. Anyway, so that was a nice experience. But in the meantime, beginning on April the 1st, the contractor started working. So now they have a crew of 3 people, and they've been there since April the 1st, working busily. Of course,
at the vet.
At the telescope.
Remind people what they're doing there.
So they are overhauling the control system of the telescope, which, as you might know, was, until we disconnected it right now, running using a 35-year-old computer, which is a little bit foolhardy, but very historic. I'm not entirely sure where the computer will end up, but we're negotiating putting some of it, at least, because it's big. So some of the computer into the little museum that the Stewart Observatory has. Anyway, so as I was saying, this work will started on April the 1st, and it will last for about 2 months. And why now? Well, because during summer months we tend to have these problems with risks of lightning strikes. So we couldn't really make sure that this work would continue uninterrupted during summer months. So I said, okay, let's go for April, because at the beginning of April there is no major risk of bad weather. So guess what happened? On April the 1st, there was actually a blizzard. So that's how the work started. We drove up across about 8 inches of snow with anyway. But it all worked out well, and the contract is well within the planned schedule. So I think we will have things working for the various stages of commissioning in about 3 weeks now.
Okay, a couple of points that came up in the chat. One, there is a link in the chat to an article that you and Chris Graney wrote on what's being done at the telescope right now. So people who want to know more details can go there. And Chris Olson asked, do you remember what kind of computer it was that used to be running the telescope for the last 35 years?
The system running on that computer is a VxWorks system. I'm not entirely sure what the make of the computer itself is.
As I recall, it was a very, very odd brand, to the point where it was hard finding power sources, power supplies for when, pieces of it. It was definitely an off brand and running custom software that, could not be ported to another machine.
That is exactly what we run here.
VxWorks
You should have called me for parts.
What's the computer that you run?
We run, so our control system, like in the main control room, uses a Windows box running a Fermi Linux, which is running an emulation of VxWorks.
Oh, now that's rather convoluted, right?
Yes.
And we also use, for most of our automation, we use KMac, which we are slowly coming away from in the next 8 years. So
well, this is what happens with, the best computers of their day 30 years later.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And I see that William had a nice chat there of where he was in Texas. So welcome, everybody. And we should get on with the program of the day because I'm really eager to hear what these guys have to tell us. I will turn it over to you, Bob Tremblay.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. This Full Moon Meetup. It is April 23rd. Our guests today are the authors of this book, which just vanished on my screen. There we go. When Science Goes Wrong, the Desire and Search for Truth. The authors are our own Brother Guy Consolmagno and Chris Graney. Brother Guy is the director of the Vatican Observatory and the president of the Vatican Observatory Foundation. Chris Graney is an adjunct scholar working for the Vatican Observatory, and he's the curator of our Faith and Science archive on our website. So how did you guys meet? Because when I started with the VO back in 2014, I believe Chris was already a staple there. So he's been around ever since I joined up. So how did you two meet?
I'll let you start, Chris.
Okay, I've moved to get out of the wind, so hopefully let me know if it starts getting noisy.
You're good.
So about in 2004, Sky and Telescope magazine published this article about Galileo observing double stars that seemed kind of odd to me. And I had before that been dealing with student questions who would ask me, things about like, how is it that people would, this is when I was in my job at Jefferson Community College in Louisville. Why is it people thought this? Why did they think that? And I had gotten interested in history to try to figure this out. And this article about the double stars it led me into an avenue of research that my first publication,
known as a rabbit hole.
A rabbit hole, that's right. And my first publication, shortening up a long story, I happened to bump into a guy named Richard Boyle, who is a Jesuit with the Vatican Observatory, but I didn't know that at the time. I was just looking for a guy with an American sounding name who I could ask questions from. And from that, I started sending the Vatican Observatory some off prints, and somehow another guy and I started talking through that work.
What I recall is that I was getting these emails from this, odd character out in Louisville, Kentucky, and I roll my eyes thinking, Kentucky, what good can come from Kentucky?
Yeah, we got us some telescopes around here.
And then for some reason, we were both in Chicago at the same time, visiting people at the Adler. So we connected there and went out to lunch and just hit it off. Discovered that we had similar bad senses of humor, I think is probably what really did it.
Yeah, it's just we've been sort of collaborating on different things on and off, and
one of the first things you were doing was work involving a great Jesuit astronomer, Jean-Baptiste Riccioli.
That's right.
Giovanni Battista Riccioli. And so, of course, being a fan of the Jesuits, I paid attention. You were actually one of the first people in modern times to read his stuff in the Latin, translating it to English, not only with the knowledge of Latin to read it, but the knowledge of astronomy to know what he was talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that there's three things that have led to, I came into research through a very strange way, not the way most people do. And when I was in graduate school, I was going to be an astrophysicist, and I ended up liking teaching more. So I went that route and never really thought I'd get into research and publication. But I've actually been able to publish a lot. And it's through those two things and my students who taught me how to look at the sky in the way that someone who doesn't know anything about how we already know things look. And a key thing here is stars. That article in Sky and Telescope was about stars. And then a contact on the internet pointed me to Riccioli as a person who wrote about stars. And that's essentially been my dog and pony show for most of my work, not all, but the same stars business shows up in our book. That it plays not a major role, but a role in the issue of science going wrong, because it turns out that for most of human history, at least most of the time, people have been observing and recording observations of the stars. What they've been recording has been right in that it's reproducible and everyone would agree on it, but wrong in terms of what they were seeing was not real.
In particular, the idea that, we talk about star magnitudes. Anybody here who's an amateur astronomer knows what the magnitude scale is. And we use that word without even thinking. Magnitude means size, not brightness.
That's right. That's
because people looking at a star are going to be looking at the airy disk, we now call it, the fuzzy dot of light caused when a pinpoint sends light waves through a hole, whether it's the pupil of your eye or the aperture of your telescope. And so you will see stars as tiny disks, and brighter stars will look like bigger disks. This was the mistake that people made, thinking that, assume all stars are like the sun. Turns out that's a bad assumption. Assume the disk that we're looking at is actually the disk of the star. Turns out that's a bad assumption. And then you can do a wonderfully careful and accurate calculation of how far away the star has to be to have the disk that's the size that we have. And they came up with completely wrong ideas of how far the stars were.
And that's what Galileo had done and that was what I had noticed in the article, is he had calculated distances. I was like, that's a double star. Those distances he's calculated, that the Earth's motion should stand out like a sore thumb with those two guys, So, and that's off we went down the rabbit hole. Off I went.
Well, the interesting thing was there were three different pieces of work that all fell together into this book. The first really goes back to 2012, I think it was. I forget what year it was. I won the Carl Sagan medal, which I could brag about, except there's at least one other Carl Sagan medal winner on this podcast right now. So, he can correct me because he got his medal before I got mine. Anyway, when you get the Carl Sagan medal, you're supposed to give a public talk. And I thought I would give a talk that basically was about my adventures as a student studying the moons of Jupiter and how I was doing all of these studies before spacecraft had been there. I mean, Pioneer had gone by, but Pioneer had seen absolutely nothing about Europa. And I wrote my thesis in the mid 1970s about the moons of Jupiter, and wound up with answers that really sound prophetic until you read the thesis and realize that I got there totally the wrong way, making all sorts of mistakes that canceled each other out. And I thought that would be an amusing story of how science is done. Then I started digging into a few other famous stories of science going wrong. The great astronomer Schiaparelli was famous for three things. He was the guy who found the canals on Mars that aren't there, optical illusions. He was the guy who saw the spots on Mercury, and every time he looked at Mercury, the spots were at the same place, and that showed him that Mercury was always facing its same face to the sun, which is a completely reasonable thing to do, because what are the odds that it's going to be in a funny, 2 to 3 residence so that he can only see every second orbit, therefore he's seeing it the same way? I mean, the odds of that kind of resonance are ridiculously tiny, except that's in fact what they are. And the third thing that Schiaparelli did was he looked at meteor showers. And as the Earth goes through a bunch of dust, we now know you get a shower in the early morning, the same time every year. And from the intensity and the direction of meteor showers, he calculated that the meteors were in the same orbit as a well-known comet, and that these dust particles and the comet were connected, which is brilliant. Even knowing the answer, I'm not sure I could figure out how to do that. And then he came to the conclusion that comets must be formed by the accretion of dust, instead of what we now know, that the dust is coming off the comet. So he did 3 really brilliant pieces of observational work and got all 3 of them wrong. So that was my funny story of science going wrong. Chris comes up with a whole bunch of other wonderfully funny stories of science going wrong. So he and I write up the Moons of Jupiter article for Sky and Telescope. And then we went back to Sky and Telescope and says, hey, Chris has got a bunch of other stories. Do you want to hear about them? And Chris, what was the answer Sky and Telescope told you?
Well, not particularly.
They weren't interested in that at all.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So although they later picked up, I've got an article coming out. They did come around on one of them, and in August I should have an article. If the proofs are in, it's just a matter of time. So, but yeah, in general, they weren't that interesting. I don't think people who are interested in science, the idea of stories of science going wrong, I think at first blush, people are like, I don't want to hear about that. But we try to emphasize that just because it's going wrong doesn't mean that it was like stupid. It's much like what you were saying about Schiaparelli. All these things that he did all had reasonable stuff behind them, just like Riccioli and the stars and these other things. So, but sometimes it doesn't work out.
And that's the important thing, that we look at the Big Bang theory now. It is a beautifully elegant theory. It explains all of the observations. It makes predictions, and the predictions are confirmed. And yet, you could have said the same thing about the science that was wrong in the early 17th century. Who knows? We don't know if 100 years from now, we'll eventually find a thread that doesn't work, and when you start pulling on the thread, the entire theory falls apart. That doesn't mean we shouldn't teach people the Big Bang theory. That doesn't mean that, we can only make progress by starting with the theory that we have, because what we're searching for is the truth. And by the very fact that we're searching for it means we don't have it. Otherwise, we wouldn't be searching for it.
Yeah, I agree.
All of this, though, came to a head. We actually, Chris and I came together and proposed a book with this as a theory, and sent it to the woman who acts as my literary agent. And she said, nah, I don't think I can sell this. No story behind it. So yeah, that's where it's at. And then
sort of like
2020.
Telescope.
Yep. And then 2020 came along and COVID hit, and we're all trapped at home. And I'm noticing how in the public concept of what science is, the general public has a very bad idea of what they can expect out of medical science. Either that it's completely perfect and it ought to work perfectly, and when it doesn't, then I don't believe it anymore. This is very frustrating, because it meant that perfectly reasonable people who absolutely saw that in some cases the science was going wrong lost all faith in the science, rather than saying, okay, this is the best we've got at the moment. What really happened, of course, that triggered it was friends of several of the people on this call here up in the Upper Peninsula. There's a great friend of mine from the science fiction world who I've known since, the 1990. And I remember when her daughter was a little kid running around science fiction conventions and interested in astronomy. So daughter grows up, marries a wonderful guy, they start a family. They're both in the medical field. Actually, she's a medical technician at a hospital, but he doesn't trust the vaccine. He gets COVID, he dies. His last words to his daughters is, 10 and 12. I'm sorry I didn't trust. I'm sorry that I'm going. It still hurts that family. And I'm thinking, this is a tragedy, but it's a tragedy because people don't understand how science works. So this becomes the beginning and end point of what has turned into the book. The original article I write, it actually came out of an interview I did for America Magazine. And one of the interviewers asks me about COVID and people trusting it, and I pop off with some clever answer that I've already forgotten what I said. This gets a lot of reaction. So I say, okay, maybe I can turn this into an article. So I write up an article in English and I submit it to a Jesuit journal in Rome called Civiltà Cattolica, which is a journal, it's a magazine of interesting philosophical questions and theological questions. And every now and then they like to have a science thing along to, fill out the volume. I don't know why. Anything that gets published actually is approved by people at the Vatican. So it's sort of semi-official. This is what the Vatican thinks. They publish my article. I immediately start getting people reacting to it. One of the next article I write is describing how people reacted to the article that reacted to the people that reacted to the article. It's just, this big meta chain. But as an example of one of the issues that came up, we all remember that one of the cries in the pro-science crowd, and I'd like to think of myself as pro-science, was follow the science. And I realized the people who were saying that had no idea of how it was being heard by the very people they were trying to convince. Because when you're talking to an evangelical Christian who's suspicious of science and you use the word follow, it sounds like, oh, I should follow the science instead of following Jesus. Which is not what they intended at all. And this reminds me, of course, Chris, of what you were saying about how the words that you would use in your classroom were being heard by the students different from the way that you intended them. You had a great story about the speed of light.
Yeah, or actually, I would say that I was hearing their words differently. That yes, I would have students ask, like, how did anyone ever measure the speed of light? And I would come out with some sort of technical discussion, starting with the story of Galileo and an assistant on two different hills opening lamps and trying to time the difference, and on to rotating mirrors and things like that. And the students would sort of look at me and nod. And it wasn't until I had learned enough history to understand how the speed of light was actually first detected, and I had an articulate student who finally said, no, how did anyone ever figure out ever think that light would have a speed in the first place? And it's like, oh, this is what people have been asking all this time. And yeah, people don't think about science the way scientists think about science. And scientists, and I know this with various colleagues at the Vatican Observatory, because I'll try to write press releases and stuff. And it's like, no, wait, guys, don't use these terms, because unless you only want to reach scientists, the rest of the world doesn't think about this in this fashion.
And the words
Yeah,
mean slightly different things, just like, the word follow the
yes, they do.
science. It sounds
Exactly.
very attractive, but what, of course, happened was I had talked about follow the science was a bad thing to say. When it got translated into Italian, rather than using the word segue, they used the word fiducia, have faith in the science, which is different from following the science. I've got, a limited amount of faith in the science. I have enough faith in my science that I'll put my name on a paper, but I also know that if the paper is any good, within 20 years, it'll be proven, if not wrong, then inadequate. Because that's the point of science, is to show that what had gone before was inadequate. And if nobody shows that your paper is inadequate, then that means nobody's bothered to read the paper, and there was no point for anybody to even use it.
I
So the
suppose
point
there's
of
a very small possibility that you could achieve the pinnacle of all and then never to be superseded. And but as we know, I don't think that's happened with anybody yet. So,
right,
you know,
and certainly not in anything worth studying. I have an image that I think has worked a lot of the times I've given talks based on the book. When I was at MIT, I was on the sailing team. And it's not just because sailing was the one bit of activity that you could do sitting down. That wasn't, I did like sailing. We were sailing these little tech dinghies, which are the size and shape and weight of bathtubs. And we were sailing them on the Charles River, which in those days was so filthy that if you capsized the boat and got in the river, you had to go immediately to the health center and get a tetanus shot.
ew.
So for 3 years, I sailed these tech dinghies, and never once did I capsize my dinghy. But never once did I win a race. And there's a connection. I was so conservative to make sure that I wouldn't capsize that I didn't push the boat to everything it could do, and the other guys could sail the boat faster and do me better. And then I remembered reading this wonderful book by Gene Kranz, who was the engineer on Apollo 13. And if you ever saw the movie, you see him saying this famous line, "Failure is not an option." Well, he actually uses that phrase in his biography. Incidentally, in the biography, you discover that he's a very devout Catholic, which is kind of fun. But he also says, "I never said that," because that's actually not something you would say. And I went back to rephrasing it to say, in science, it's not that failure is not an option. It's that failure isn't an option, it's a requirement. And yet, as Chris points out, there are places where science goes wrong and it doesn't make a funny story. It actually makes a serious and kind of, makes you go, oh, we really did something wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. Just out of curiosity, guys. So, you give a lot more talks to me. I've given a couple talks that have touched on this. What has people's reaction been to the talks you've given under the title of the book?
Well, they've been entertained because I think everybody likes to see funny stories of people going wrong. It makes you feel less bad when you go wrong to realize that people who you thought were experts also go wrong. I'll put it this way. You can tell from the gray hair, I'm an old baby boomer. And like every kid growing up in the 60s, I had a rock band in my basement, which thankfully never played anywhere except in my basement because we were terrible. But there was this record album I loved to listen to, which was John Lennon and Yoko Ono and the Plastic Ono Band. And it was, some great musicians. Eric Clapton was on it. And my God, they sounded terrible. And they were out of tune. And they were just, painful to listen to. You go, if Eric Clapton can sound that bad, I can sound as good as Eric Clapton. Wow. So I think there's a kind of a joy in realizing that smart people like Galileo could be brilliant, but go wrong and still be brilliant. It doesn't reduce their brilliantness. It's just the fact that they're human. And in a lot of cases, we stumble towards the truth. We've been doing all of this talking, and Bob has had to ask exactly one question so far.
I know.
So
I was sick of that. So maybe Bob has another question. We can
Yeah,
trap this up.
I did. And the question was, how's the reaction from the book been, Chris? So what do you think is the most humorous anecdote out of the book?
Well,
You go.
I was going to say the funniest story to me is the one that Chris Graney discovered about the two spheres theory of the world covered with an ocean. And Chris, is that yours? Do you want to go talk
Yeah,
about that a little bit?
that's mine also, which also happens to be, um, there's some it's kind of weird. Guy and I have worked well, it's been very hand in glove in this because I remember, I was in Rome and we were walking around, guys like, we need another topic, and I have one in mind, but I'm wondering if you have any ideas. And I think I said the two spheres theory, and that was the one you had been waiting on, you had been thinking of. And yeah, it's this idea that people, there was, for various reasons, they expected that there should be vastly more water than land. And it's just great. You can find stuff in the Bible to back it up. You can find people using it as proof of the existence of God. You can find it repeated, for over from the same sort of religious text. You can see him pointing to the science of the sea being greater than the land for over 100 years. As sort of a catechist, a thing that shows up in a catechism, not a Catholic catechism in this case, but you might be able to dig up a Catholic catechism that where someone said this. It's just amazing. You think, where in the world did anyone ever come up with the idea that that dirt is that the earth we stand on is a blob of hollow rock floating in a ball of water? But by golly, it was there.
And of course, you realize that misconception continues. When you show people a picture from the space shuttle or from the space station of the Earth, and you can see the atmosphere, and you realize how thin the atmosphere is compared to the Earth. This boggles people's mind to this day, because you look outside and as far as you can see up, it's air. So you assume that there must be this giant ball of air around the Earth, and why shouldn't there also be a giant ball of water around the Earth? But that's not what's there. That's just the conception we have of what's there. So it's, very believable once you realize that that misconception carries on even to this day.
Is it any more
And
crazy than the thought of living on the crust of a giant ball of lava?
Yeah. No, you are correct. Or, the thing that we're telling everyone now is that, the stuff that we are makes up, 5% of the universe or something like that, and that everything else out there is energy and matter of forms that we have no familiarity with. And so
Yeah.
yeah, it is. But that's my favorite story. I think that the stuff about measuring people, um, I think is probably stuff that people are not super familiar with, and I like that we've ended it with something that's not just another humorous story, but the two spheres theory is, of course, the thing is that another good part is that I like is that Guy tied that Moons of Jupiter story in with Harry Potter, so that's good too. But I talked to a guy yesterday who read the book, and he sang its praises. So I hope you all get it and read it and recommend it to your friends. And if you don't like it, uh, that's not working, Bob. There's something weird about that book cover that's blanking out.
You're going to have to get rid of your background screen, I think, so people can see it.
Yeah, but it's if you don't like it, I'd be interested in hearing. I mean, I'd be interested in hearing criticism. I'd be interested in hearing favorable comments too, of course.
One of the questions that came up in the chat, and I wasn't so involved with the publisher as you were, was where did the cover come from? Do you have any insight as to how they came up with that cover?
No, but my godson had some insight. So they presented us with 3 covers and said, "What do you all like?" And that was the cover both Guy and we both independently picked. But the other 2 were sort of similar. They were like a canoe on water, and then something was just water. I think they wanted the water theme because of the two spheres theory section. I had actually suggested sort of like a historical thing of like a storm or something. But my godson, who I gave the book to, and I don't know if he read it, but he did do a Google search, an image search for similar images, and he found the photograph on which it is based from. and it's obvious they took the photo. It's pretty much a straight photograph that they've added some distortions, but they gave us those three, and that's we chose it.
It's sort of like science is the boat, and the boat's been beached because it's gone wrong. That's kind of the way that I saw it.
Yeah, and the whole picture's kind of gone wrong too, because it's, things are blurred and the boat is twisted and stuff like that. And so we also, interesting thing that is that the book is up for an award. It's a finalist for an award, and the uh, in the theology category. And I never would have guessed that something I wrote would be up in for an award in theology.
Well, as Joel points out in the chat, one of the things we talk about, especially in the last chapter, is the epistemology of authority. And who do you trust, and why do you trust people? As soon as they've gone wrong once, does that mean you never trust them again? This is, I guess, something that every teenager has to deal with. But as I mentioned, there was a button that a friend of mine had in high school with a big, this is a big teenager's button, question authority. And I went up to them and I said, question authority, says who? And I don't think they got the joke.
Yeah. So, but yeah, it's thanks, Bob. It's in the American Catholic Publishing's Publishers Excellence in Publishing Awards. So that's but so if we place for what was it, we can win, place, or show. From Kentucky, I have to speak in horse racing language. So I'm sure we'll be talking it up if we make
Right.
an award.
Right now, it's a
award-winning book.
finalist. It's in the top 25, I believe.
Something
Well,
like that, yeah.
Out of how many books in that category published this past year? 25?
No, it's not as many. I think I think it's less than 25. I think it's more
I
like
think
6 or 8.
in
that
our
we've- that we're
subcommittee, in our subdivision, I think there's maybe 6. So that's pretty good.
Yeah. So I'm happy about it. I lost track of it. Oh, they let us do an index that was I did the index, and I really had a good time putting it together. I don't know if anyone noticed that this is an index where I tried to put humor into the index. So I don't.
Give us one example of an Easter egg in the index.
The most obvious example, there's 2. One is I made sure to put Bigfoot in the index, even though Bigfoot only shows up once in the book. I made sure
Right.
Bigfoot made it in. I made sure, but the goofiest one is it's under science, and you have all these subheadings: science this, science that, science the other thing, and science, comma, going wrong. And if you look at the entrance, it covers all the pages of the book. So the whole thing.
I hadn't noticed that.
Yeah.
There was a famous textbook, math textbook that we used 50 years ago. And it was, sort of the calculus book that everybody used. And in the index was the word whales. And when you go to that page, it was the plot of a particular function. And you look at it and you go, oh my gosh, it looks like a whale.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Well, so
So-
see, glad to see some of the other people have done it. So, and I'm happy to see Gary says he read it, and that's I'm glad, and I'm glad to get the feedback. And I think we cover stuff that people don't think about and haven't, and I hope that the book catches on a bit.
Right. So we've got, basically we're running down to the last 2 or 3 minutes here. Are there any questions from the audience, things that people wanted to ask, or, how rich are we getting from this book? Not very.
I'd actually be interested to know, you wrote this during COVID, you said? How'd you do that? Did you collaborate on like shared Google Drive or something like that? How'd you do it?
We just sent files back and forth to each other.
Yeah, so I was scheduled to go to Rome. I had a research project, and it fell right at COVID. It got canceled, and by the time COVID cleared out, I I had lost my fire for that particular project, but I still had tickets, and so I came and a guy said, "Come in," and when I showed up as the guest house, like, so what are you going to do? And the guy said, "We're going to write a book," you know, and we put together the basic stuff in the week or so that I was there, and then so we did some face to face. Walking, it was very picturesque, walk around the papal
Right.
gardens discussing the history of science, and that was cool.
Yeah.
But then
We
after that,
we
more
were looking
mundane.
for a photograph of what the deep sea looked like, and you said, "Oh, I've got this great picture of the Mediterranean." I said, "Except the Mediterranean isn't actually what they're talking about in the book." He goes,
That's right.
"Oh, yeah,
That's
you're
right.
right."
It's not a
But I
mark.
remember having that argument while we were wandering through the gardens.
Yeah. And so, and then, but the rest of it was like, via email and not using anything fancy, just shooting Word files back and forth, you know.
And it
So,
worked.
yeah.
Also, we should point out that we had a few other people helping out, reading it and correcting, and mostly friends of yours.
Yeah, well, my wife did it, and a lady she works with at church who is also my wife works at our parish, and so does Angela Elliott. And Angela Elliott's also the mother of two of my godchildren. And those two, you go through that book. I've been through. We do not have a bunch of typos in that book. And we can thank those guys for it. I mean, and it
Right.
makes your book. If you don't have a bunch of errors, it helps make your book look credible.
Indeed.
I appreciate their work very much.
Anything else? Any other comments that people want to throw in? There's a bunch of interesting comments.
Somebody mentioned Thomas Merton from Kentucky, and so.
Oh yes, absolutely. Who else good comes from Kentucky? There are a
That's
few
right.
good people come from Kentucky. I know that.
So, and let's see. History is written by the victors, but as you write in science, it might be helpful to learn about the losing views as well. Yeah, I think that's a good comment because the thing is the problem, and this goes to I'm watching the time. I don't want to yammer on over
Sure,
the end,
go on.
but what you were saying about the pandemic, the problem is science is a great way of getting to the answer eventually. That does not mean that it's the best that we got the right answer now, and we got to keep that in mind. And if we don't, we end up with some of the problems that we had with the pandemic. There's got to be some humility to science, and I think looking at those losing views, as Gary said, can help with that. And I hope that we get that our book gets spreads around a bit and helps people with that perspective, because we're going to have some other thing where we need science, and we got to keep in mind that it's the best thing we got, but it doesn't mean it's absolute.
Talking about science and humility, I'm reminded when I was a novice in the Jesuits, a year ahead of me was a fellow who entered the Jesuits after being many years an emergency room doctor. And he's still a doctor now at a hospital here in Chicago as a Jesuit. But as a novice, he was sent to do an experiment for a few months in Nigeria. And he came back, told the rest of us his experience. And he says, I'm an emergency room doctor. And the one thing you learn quickly is you're God, you're always right, and you're going to cure these people, because you can't go in with fear of making a mistake. You just have to, this is it, I've seen this before, do this. And he said, when I'd walk through the hallways in the hospital in Lagos, and I would see people who were sick, and I knew what was wrong with them, and I knew what was needed to cure them, and I knew I couldn't do it. We didn't have the technicians, we didn't have the medicines, we didn't have all the resources you have back in America. And the way he put it was, I used to think I was the one curing those people. And I realized it's a whole system of people. And it's a whole system of people who have to, get it right. And in the process, being certainly medicine is in a different place from science, because on the one hand, if you don't experiment, you never know how to improve the medicine. But on the other hand, I don't want to be the guinea pig that they're experimenting on.
Right. And
So
sometimes, yeah, sometimes they're in medicine that's gone wrong because they haven't let people who are the guinea pigs know that they're the guinea pigs, or the guinea pigs didn't have choices, you know. So yeah.
Right. Or they were afraid to do anything different from what they had done for understandable reasons.
Yeah. So, well, I like all these comments, and I'm looking at the comments about like the bubonic plague and stuff like that, and I'm glad to see people interested in, you know, in stuff we've written.
Yeah.
And I will. A little bit of this will show up in the Sky and Telescope article that's coming out.
Great.
So do
Any
you have
other
enough
questions?
material for a sequel?
We may. I don't think Guy has time for a sequel. We were sort of at the eclipse. I
Right.
said, "Hey, how are you doing time for a writing project?" And Guy's so like, "Wait, not now." You know.
I've got a book that is in sort of the final process. It's going to the public, going to the printer in a couple of months, for which somebody else on this did a lot of really essential proofreading, and I thank him for it. So I've got a number of good friends here. And in the process of doing that, we had this past summer somebody show up at the Vatican Observatory in Rome, who's an illustrator of children's books, did a book called Audacious Ignatius. And we're talking about doing a children's book about the Vatican Observatory. So stay tuned. Many more in the process. We've blown through our 12 o'clock time. So Bob, can you sign us off?
All righty. Well, thank you everyone for showing up. See you next month at our next full moon meetup. Clear skies, everyone.
Adios.
And I guess, Brother Guy, am I going to see you in an hour?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, lunchtime for me. I'll see you in an hour, brother.
Yep, same here.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.